this is one thing that I've experienced, and I know that psychedelics have paved the way for you to have these direct experiences. And I can say, in the moment of the psychedelics, I am a believer. Like, I'm 100%. I often, when I'm in the experience, I'm like, you fucking moron. Like, how could you have been so foolish to ask some silly, asinine question about the truth of this? But then as I get farther and farther away from it, I go, well, wait a second. Like, that is as real to me as the breakfast that I ate 4 hours ago or my memory of something that happened in my childhood. It is, I no longer have direct access to that. So how do you remain certain in your normal life of the absolute truth that you it feels like you encounter in those situations, in the same way that, like, I'll have a dream and I'll be absolutely certain that it's true,
right,
and then have a different experience which makes me question that. So
right.
That's something that I felt like I've experienced the oneness and all of these sorts of things, but then as I get away from it, I go, are you sure that was...
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest objections that many scientific materialists raise when you start talking about psychedelics. And by the way, it's important to say that I haven't just encountered these things on psychedelics. You can do it totally sober. So the biggest, and I've had sober experiences through meditation and so forth. So the biggest objection that scientific materialists have about psychedelics is to say, oh, it's just a hallucination. Everything is just, it's just neurons in the brain, doing stuff, chemicals. I mean, isn't it obvious that if you're taking a chemical, putting neurotransmitters into your mind, that's going to, get you to believe all sorts of crazy, wacky things. And, we know people have religious experiences and mystical experiences, and people even, have psychotic experiences. So what does this really tell us about absolute truth? I mean, everybody thinks that they have absolute truth when they're in fact deluded. Well, but you have to apply that same logic and doubt to your own scientific materialistic position. See, here's the fundamental problem, is that the mind loves to doubt everything except its own self. So it's not that I just went out there and did a bunch of psychedelics and then started to believe my own bullshit, which, some people tend to think. What happened was that even long before I even started doing psychedelics, I was deeply questioning the nature of reality and epistemology and how I know anything. I questioned religion, science, mysticism, philosophy, every philosophical school, everything. So basically what I did was I deconstructed my own mind and reality itself until nothing remained, until there was no more attachments, assumptions, or anything. And then when you do the psychedelics, that takes you to even a higher level. And so what you realize is that, yes, psychedelics are hallucinations, but what you are failing to take into account is that everything is a hallucination. So this moment right now is a hallucination. And also, we should note, from the scientific perspective, this moment right now is mediated by and rendered by neurotransmitters. You cannot be having this experience without neurotransmitters in here. Now, some people say DMT is naturally produced by the brain. I don't even know if we have good evidence of that. Seems like there's some good evidence of that, but it's not even about DMT. You have serotonin, you have epinephrine, norepinephrine, you have a bunch of chemicals. You have a chemical soup in here, constantly churning away. Mm-hmm. And it is rendering your view of regular life, everything you think about yourself, your family, the world, the universe, and even the scientific method that you're using to study this thing and to do the chemistry on it, that itself is mediated, as science says, obviously, by the neurotransmitters in here, mm-hmm. right? So, I mean, it's almost laughably obvious, and yet almost no scientist realizes this or admits it, is that if you say that putting neurotransmitters in here, and psychedelics are just neurotransmitters.
Yep. Or yeah.
Thinking of them as drugs is really a problem. They're neurotransmitters. Different kinds. You put them in here, it changes how your consciousness functions. But you can't just assume that the way your consciousness functions sort of normally by default, that this is the true way, that this reveals that this is the best, truest version of reality we have, or that the skepticism that is arising right now, so right now you're skeptical, you're having doubts about whether any of this is true or whether what I'm saying is true, that doubt itself, you have to recognize, is only a function of what's going on in here. So if we change this, the idea of how you do science completely flies out the window. Mm-hmm. Right? So you can't just assume that there is some sort of simplified objective scientific method and that we're using this to understand stuff, and then you take a psychedelic and it sends you some sort of hallucination. No. I mean, it's always been a hallucination. That's what reality is. It's a hallucination. And now we should focus on this term hallucination, because people don't have a good grasp of this term. I actually use this term. I love this term. I don't shy away from it. I embrace it, because it has a very technical meaning. In psychology, hallucination means perception without any input or data. So traditionally, if you go to a mental hospital and you're telling them that you're seeing monkeys running around with stripes and polka dots, they'll say you're hallucinating, because they'll say, well, you might be perceiving that in your consciousness, but it's not out here in the objective world. Right? So something's going on where you're experiencing something, but the experience isn't corresponding to there's nothing underneath the experience. The way we would say, normal experience, like if you see a tree, we agree that tree is over there. All of us agrees, like there's green plants behind me. All of us agree. And so we say, we're not hallucinating because there's actually plants behind me. Mm-hmm. But if you look closely, of these plants, you've got nothing but your perception of them. There's nothing ever behind your perceptions. That's an assumption. That's one of the key assumptions of the scientific materialistic paradigm, is that there's something sourcing perception. And so I like to...
One sec. I have a question about this. So it seems like I want to give the devil its due here, if you will, in that I suppose maybe this might be different for a schizophrenic person, but if I were to walk into a tree, I would perceive pain, when I smash my head into it. And so it seems that one of the things that really makes us trust the sober hallucination, if you will, is the perception of pain and pleasure,
yes.
which lends seriousness to treating things as if they are real, even though we're not necessarily accessing the behind the phenomena.
Yeah. And I mean, pain and fear, suffering, these are the greatest illusions mm-hmm. because you don't question them. You see, usually when we're just sitting comfortably here on this couch or in that room, we're both comfortable and our survival is not threatened. So this takes us into the issue of survival. See, all living beings are in an existential bind for survival. We have to be surviving all the time. If we're not surviving and we're not successful at it, then we're dead and we're not here and we can't be talking or thinking about survival or deeper philosophical issues and asking these questions. So everything assumes that you're surviving relatively well. If you can't handle that, nothing else is possible. So this puts us into an existential bind. So, we can sit here and be rational about things and be philosophers, but then, if I take a knife and stick it into your gut, all philosophy, all science goes out the window. Nothing matters. And look, notice this: all of your logic and reason goes out the window too. Mm-hmm. There's no logic or reason when I stab you with a knife in the gut. At that point, you're going to be reacting like an animal. You're going to be yelling, screaming. You're going to be attacking me. You're going to be fighting me, biting me. You're going to be, holding your. All of this is going to happen instinctually. There's not going to be any logic or reason behind it. You're just going to be acting out to save your ass, and that's because you had to, because that's how you got to where you are today. And so did I, and so did everybody.
And so this is one of the things that I want to give, the sober hallucination credit for, is that it does seem to be non-negotiable in those situations. And perhaps it is. Perhaps the most sophisticated of Buddhist monks could get stabbed in the gut. But that's something that I try to remain aware of, which is, we can talk and chat about what's real as much as we want. But when suffering is experienced,
right,
it rips you right out of these philosophical conversations into... That knife is real. Is that knife outside of me or inside of me?
We have to be careful. Is that real? Why? So
or it grabs me as real, I should say.
It grabs you, but I mean, really question this. It's not very difficult to question this. Why on earth would suffering and pain have anything to do with something being real? What's the connection?
Well, the connection, and again, I'll play. I do agree.
Yeah, I love it. Go for it.
I'll play the devil's advocate here.
Do it.
Is that, and this is the issue of survival. If I treat it as unreal, I cease to be. Right? If I treat this knife wound If I treat this knife wound as unreal, I bleed out, and the pain isn't real, and I cease to be. And so the things that have persisted,
who cares?
Exactly.
I mean, Does science care? I mean, if you want to be really scientific, let's be scientific. I mean, I'm all about being scientific. I consider everything I talk about and I do as science. It's just a higher level of science. You have to be really objective with your science. The problem here is objectivity, neutrality, and lack of bias. So when people make an argument against what I say by saying that, oh, well, Leo, but if I stabbed you with a knife, you would be in pain and you would be, a hypocrite and all this sorts of stuff. Look, yeah, if you stabbed me with a knife, I would be in pain, but that has nothing to do with the truth of the matter. Like, scientifically speaking, if I stab Albert Einstein while he's giving his lecture, does that change the truth of general relativity? No, it has nothing to do with it. Like, yeah, Albert Einstein is a fragile, or was a fragile, creature. He could easily be killed and made uncomfortable and all this. And whenever you're doing your science, when you're doing science, you also have to do it in very comfortable conditions. Like, to do science, you can't be doing good science in a war zone or something like that. Like, you got to have a lab where things are peaceful and stable, and then you could do your science. Otherwise, you can't. And universities sort of create that sort of cloistered environment wherein science and academia could be done, because otherwise survival it's going to be war. People are going to be fighting each other, murdering each other, and there's no science, there's no logic, there's no reason. You can't be reasonable when your life is in danger.
Well, I actually, with that small point, I would say that there is science done on a battlefield. What is the best way to kill someone is tested, and when do I have to put the ammo in? How much ammo can I shoot before I need to reload? These sorts of things are tested. And so I want to expand science beyond the things that are simply done in labatorries, which is
sure, yeah.
But yeah, so it sounds like what I'm hearing.
The science of killing is probably the oldest science.
Sure. Yeah. And it really calls what truth is to most people and is to me, and I'm not really sure if it ought to be otherwise, is the measure of truth is effectiveness. Does it, and I'm not saying it ought to be effectiveness, but the way that we treat it.
That is the original corruption. That is the original corruption of the human mind, is that, you see, when we think about it, most people, they don't care about truth. Most people care about survival.
What works. Yeah. So they don't care about what is, they care about what works.
And when I talk about survival, I don't just mean physically living. Survival for me is a much broader notion, which also includes thriving, it includes success, it includes reproduction, it includes love, it includes getting approval from your friends, it includes, going golfing with your golf buddies. That's all survival. That's how you survive. Humans invent more sophisticated ways of survival. Some of them are extremely ridiculous and elaborate, like, wearing gold chains and diamond pinky rings and all this sorts of nonsense. This is survival for, kids in the hood or whatever it is. Or, having a golden toilet. For some people, this is their version of survival, even though it's completely unnecessary. But, who's to say what's necessary in life? This is all subjective stuff. What kind of food you eat, even that, people have different ideas of what kind of food they need or want, and a lot of the food that people eat is garbage, poison, and they still love it. For them, it's survival. So it's very much
what is the problem with treating? Why is it corrupting? You said that's the original corruption, is that the measure of truth is effectiveness. That, I think, goes unspoken and completely assumed by the way that we behave, right? Like, how do you know that people will say, like, well, the social sciences never put man on the moon, and it's, the measure of the truth of the physics was that it was effective. It did what we wanted it to do. Right. What else is there other than effectiveness? Right.
So this gets us into this is what you're talking about here, is sort of the pragmatic conception of truth. And a lot of people these days, along with scientific materialism, comes sort of all this stuff is very sneaky and implicit. You don't really know you're carrying this around with you, but you are a pragmatic conception of life. It's sort of this pragmatic philosophy that, well, like, we can do all this philosophy and fancy talking and academic stuff, but in the end, what really matters is how I feel about my life. Do I have the kind of girlfriend I want? Do I have the money I want? All this sorts of stuff. And even within this penetrates into the scientific domain in the sense that, look, when you fundamentally think of reality as a material, objective object, a collection of objects that are kind of just bouncing around in a mechanistic way, and that's all that reality is, it's just mechanics, pure mechanics. And you boil everything down to just physics. It's just atoms bouncing around in a giant three-dimensional container that is the universe. When you boil it down to that, then yeah, what else is there to life but just the mechanics of life And just, survival of the fittest and reproduction, that's like all there is. And then how you feel about it. And then within science, we see, to get humans to actually agree on worldviews and on their thinking about reality, it's very effective to have some sort of external objective standard, some sort of measure like a ruler or a yardstick that we can use and all agree upon, because that helps us to build a consensus and all kind of be thinking along the same lines. And this is necessary to build a society with millions of people and to have a university and so forth. And I mean, science is very much a collective activity. It involves consensus building. So within hard sciences, we tend to cite examples like landing a man on the moon. Yeah, that's effective, but also look at it like this. Look, we can turn this around on the scientist, because the atheist would say, well, if I was a Christian, I came to you and I said, well, God exists and you should believe in God and you should believe in my Christian dogma. As an atheist or a rationalist or a materialist, you would say, well, maybe I'll even grant you that God makes you happy because, you have this belief in the afterlife and this makes you happy in some way. And this may be even good for you because you act nicer. You're more moral because you're afraid that you're going to go to hell. So that, that gives you a little incentive to not be an asshole to your family and so forth and not to commit crimes. And so, yeah, maybe that's even good. I'll grant you that's even good for society. Maybe it's even good to have this sort of illusion, but it's just an illusion. It's a wishful thinking. It's not true, right? That's how atheists would argue against religious dogma. But notice that when the atheist argues this way, the atheist is arguing for actually some notion of truth which is deeper than just utility.
Are they? So what I perceive is that they're arguing from just a different level of survival effectiveness, which is to say that in their life, that what effectively gets them they don't need the man in the sky type God, and so what works for them to survive is intellectual posturing or these other sorts of things that get them. And so I wonder if they really are arguing for a truth that goes beyond effectiveness, or just for a different rubric for effectiveness in their own life.
They may not know that they are, but I would submit to you that any serious intellectual or scientist or rationalist, if you really sit down with him for hours and you corner him, you got to really corner him because he's going to be slippery. His mind's going to be very slippery. So if you take a pragmatist and you really corner him, eventually you'll corner him into such a position where he will be forced to admit that there is something that he values that we might call essential truth that is not simply utility. Because the problem with a utilitarian or pragmatic notion of truth is that it's so easily corrupted and it leads to so many falsehoods. So let me give you some examples here. Let's say you want to be a pure pragmatist and you believe that, like, what is scientifically true, objectively true, is just that which is effective. Well, there's a lot of effective stuff that you can do which we know is not going to be true in the long run. Mm-hmm. Like, for example,
so one of the example
you can
the
land
gun.
Like, you can land a man on the moon probably using Newtonian mechanics.
Sure.
You probably don't, I don't know if this is technically true, you probably don't need Einstein's general relativity to land a man on the moon.
A great example that is even more simpler is of the loaded gun. Brett Weinstein brings this up, which is the idea that you treat all guns as if they're loaded. And that's a very effective way to behave around guns. But we all have this intuition that, like, but that's not true. Like, some of these guns don't have bullets in them. So if whether or not you need general relativity to get to the moon, I don't know either.
Well, look, here's the crux of it, is that lies can be extremely effective.
Sure.
And falsehood can be extremely effective, and deception can be extremely effective. And in fact, the majority of what we're doing in the world is our mind is constructing fictions, illusions, ideologies, dogmas, false beliefs, which are extremely effective for short-term survival, but then later we realize they're not true. Mm-hmm. So
is it the case that
you can't just operate in life based on what is effective, because that will lead you down the road of what I call devilry.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that is probably devilry in me is that maybe there's a kernel of it, but my interest in the truth, which I would say runs deeper than most people's, comes from a recognition that while lies are effective in the short term, that maybe there's something in it for me if I pursue this truth and take the short-term hit. But I haven't totally let go of the idea that truth might be bliss. Truth might be, might be an end to suffering. Like, I still want the carrot, if that makes sense. And quite frankly, I don't know how I wouldn't.
Right. And yeah, that's also survival.
Hope that you guys enjoyed that clip. If you want to see more like this and have us do more podcasts, we are 100% funded by our generous patrons. And if you'd like to contribute, there's a link in the description, and we'll have one pop up on the screen right here so that we can do more podcasts where we have fun conversations and hopefully some deep ones like this. Either way, hope that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.